So as we've discussed, in the United States, typically oil and gas is owned by whoever owns the overall property above that oil and gas. And so for that reason, we need to talk about the ways that you determine who owns a particular property in the United States. And so in your book, there are several basic land description systems that are described. So the system that's used in Texas and the most traditional system is meets and bounds. And so that's just non-systematic description. You use whatever baselines you have. So you might say, well, my property has a river on one side and a road on the other. Or you could use any sort of local description that comes to hand. Now, what's used in most states is the public land survey, which is a more systematic rectangular system that uses certain baselines and meridians to establish where a property is located. Obviously, you can use a map. That's often used in practice in Texas. You don't want to rely on those meets and bounds. If you live in a suburban subsection, you might say, hey, we have a map file that defines exactly what my property entails. And of course, you can also use coordinates, GPS coordinates, to precisely locate what the corners of your property are. Now, if you look further at these land description systems, the system that's used in most of the United States, that public land system, that rectangular survey system, was mandated by Congress in 1785. But that original 13 states, and also Texas, some places in the Southwest, use that traditional meets and bounds system. These also systems are important because for oil and gas attorneys, you need to know who owns what precise property. You need to know that for two big reasons. One is you want to know where I can put my oil and gas well, so where do I own precisely, and also you want to know how much acreage you have. And as we'll see in future courses, sometimes if you have a well that is shared between two different parties, two neighbors, how much each party gets will depend on how much acreage they have. So you want to know where your land extends to and how much acreage you have. So if we take a further look at this public land system that is this rectangular system based on baselines and meridians, you can see that they extend over most of the country, except for Texas, including most of the major oil producing states. So New Mexico, the #2 producer, North Dakota, the #3 producer, as well as Oklahoma, which has traditionally been an important oil and gas producer. They, like most states, use that public land survey system. They use that rectangular system. And what you can see here is that there are, in most of those states, just a couple baselines and meridians that define where a property is. If you look carefully, though, in a place like Ohio, as we zoom in, you can see that because that was developed right after the system was developed in 1785, there are a very complicated system of baselines and meridians. So it gets very complicated. By contrast, if you look around Texas for these later developments, you can see that in a place like Oklahoma, there's really just one major baseline, one major meridian, the Indian Meridian, that defines where a property is. So if we wanted to look at a particular township, a township is an area of land that's about 6 miles on a side. Often it's owned by lots of different parties. But for that 6 mile on a side township, as we zoom in, we see that a township in Oklahoma could be defined as township 4 north, range 3 east. So you go from that baseline, you go 4 north, and if you go from that meridian, that Indian Meridian, you go 3 east, and then you find your township. Okay, let's zoom in again, because obviously a township 6 miles on the side, typically there'll be lots of different owners. The most, one common thing that an owner could have is 640 acres, which is 1 mile on each side. So each township, which is 6 miles on each side, would normally have 6 sections on each side, 1 mile sections, and 36 in total in that township. 6 by 6 grid, 36 sections within that township. Now, normally the way that you number those townships is you start with that northeast quarter, that top east corner, and you number across going west, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you go down 1, south 1, and you number back across going east, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You continue numbering back and forth like that. That order, which you may know from fantasy football drafts, that's called, where you go back and forth like that, that's called boustrophodonic. That's a Greek word that means you're walking like a cow. back and forth, pulling that plow across the field. So your next fantasy football draft, you want to tell somebody it's a bootstrapedonic order or the same order that sections follow across the township, whatever you think will get you the most cred in that situation. So that's how you number sections. Let's zoom in even further, because a section, 1 mile on a side, that's 640 acres. That's still pretty big. So often that will be subdivided between lots of different landowners. And so you can see here, we've zoomed in on that section. And so it's 640 acres total. If I just take 1/4, like that top right northeast quarter, that's 160 acres. But sometimes in your text, we'll deal with even smaller properties that are subdivided further. When you do that, it can get tricky how you describe that in words and match that up with where exactly that property is in the section. And for that reason, we're going to do a very complex example, which is looking at that tiny little X that you see in the bottom right of that full 640 acre section. It says X, and then it says 330F underneath it. Okay, we're going to try and figure out how you would describe where that property is in words, because sometimes in your book you'll have a property described in words, and you'll want to be able to say, well, where exactly is that in the section? And so those examples, I promise you, will be simpler than this one, but let's look at a complicated example so you'll feel comfortable when you reach that in the book. You might need to watch this a couple times to get it, because it is complex, but it's a skill that you want to develop. Because the correct legal description for that tiny little property marked with an X, it's just 2.5 acres, is the southeast 1/4 of the southeast 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the southeast 1/4 of that section as a whole. So gives us the example here, the section is called section O in township O, but the important thing is that if you take that whole 640 acre section that we're looking at, this is the southeast 1/4 of the southeast 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the southeast 1/4. So when you see that kind of description in your book, it will be hard to figure out where exactly is that in the section. So what I would recommend you do is draw out that full 640 acre section. Then what I would do is start at the end. Okay, so you had 4 descriptions: southeast, southeast, southwest, southeast. Start with that last one, southeast, and say, okay, well, that's pretty easy, because if I look at this full 648 acre section, I can figure out which one is the southeast quarter. So I just take the southeast quarter of that, right? That's on the bottom right. So I see the northeast quarter, 160 acres just above it, and then just below that southeast quarter on the bottom right, and it itself is divided into a lot of pieces, one of which is the property I'm trying to describe, okay? Then I go back. So I had southeast quarter, now I go the next one, working backwards, southwest 1/4. So I take the southwest 1/4 of that southeast 1/4. So I take that full southeast 1/4 in the bottom right, and I take the southwest, that's the bottom left quarter of that. And you can see, looking at our section, there's a lot of properties there too. There's actually 6 properties. There's 1 property, 2 property, 3 property, 4 property, 5, 6. And the bottom right one is our property. Okay, so again, working backwards. Southeast, southwest, southeast 1/4. Okay, so then I look at that little subsection that I was looking at and say, what's the southeast corner of that, that bottom right corner? And that just includes 3 properties, my one marked with X and 2 others. And then I take the southeast quarter of that subsection and I find my little X. Okay, so my recommendation is when you run across these in your book, and I promise they won't be quite this complicated, you want to draw the full 640 acre section and then start subdividing it to figure out what property you're talking about, starting at the end and working your way backwards to the full property.